Good morning, students. Today we begin with Marxist theory. I have already shared the PPT with you. In this class, we'll be discussing the major ideas related to this Marxist theory. As you know, Marxism is a philosophy which was conceived for changing the world. These are the words of Karl Marx. He says the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. So, all other philosophies try to understand the world while Marxism seeks to change it. Marxism saw progress as coming through all those struggles of power between all those different social classes. So basically, there is this concept of change, concept of progress, which makes this theory, Marxist theory, distinct. And Marxian literary criticism is that literary criticism which views all those literary works as a product of the society, as a reflection of the social institutions from which they generate. And it is based on this approach of historical materialism developed by German philosophers Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. As you know, both of them, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, are the joint founders of this thought. They called their economic theories as communism rather than Marxism. And they designated their belief in the state ownership of industry, transport, etc., rather than supporting private ownership. So both of them announced this advent of communism in their jointly written work, Communist Manifesto of 1848. They developed this conceptual tool and methodology of historical materialism based on the approach of dialectical materialism. And they tried to understand the economy and society of 19th century Europe with this approach of dialectical materialism, and it provided a critique of capitalism. And as I said earlier, their main aim was to bring about a change, not just to understand the world. So they used this approach known as dialectical materialism and the tools of historical materialism to understand, and more than that, to bring about a change, to provide a critique of capitalism and to understand the economy and society of 19th century Europe. They saw conflict as the basis of all social change. This is what they said. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. As I said earlier, there is this struggle for power between different social classes, and it brings about a certain conflict, and that conflict is the basis of all social changes. So here Marxism is completely different from other social theories because, as I said earlier, it focuses more on it stresses on the importance of conflicts which bring about all those changes and revolution. And secondly, putting forward praxis. It announced, it tried to state that only action, praxis, can bring about a change. And later, thirdly, all these social forces are ultimately decided by economic systems. So that is something like an economic determinism, that all these economic systems decide this change in the society. These are their famous words. They say, it is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. Or They say like this: consciousness does not determine life, life determines social consciousness. So it is your social reality which determines the individual rather than the other way around. So look at the psychoanalytic theory. Psychoanalytic theory is a theory which focuses only on individuals. It completely isolates individual from the social system in which they live in. Unlike those theories, here Marxism places more importance to the social forces. It is the social reality which shapes a human being according to them. So these are the factors which makes Marxism distinct. They believe that conflict, there is something like struggle for power, and that will essentially bring about a social change. So they put forward praxis or action to change the world, and they believe that it is the economic system which brings about this change. Economic system which determines the social reality. And what is dialectical materialism? Marx and Engels arrived at this dialectical materialism by integrating this materialistic approach with dialectics propounded by German thinker Hegel. Hegel actually propounded this theory of dialectical idealism. Marx completely rejected this idealism from Hegel's dialectical approach, and he replaced it with materialism. Marxism, as you know, is basically a materialist philosophy. It tries to explain without assuming that there is this existence of a world or forces beyond the natural world. They completely rejected that idea that there exists a world beyond our understanding. It looks for concrete, scientific, logical explanations of the world, of, of all those observable facts, which is completely opposite to idealist philosophy. Idealist philosophy is something where you believe in the existence of a spiritual world or something like a world elsewhere, which would offer, for instance, some kind of religious explanations of life and thought. So basically, Hegel talked about that dialectical idealism. Marx took this idea of dialectics into and combined with materialism because he believed that the reality is shaped by all those material forces and it should be explained by material realities. There is nothing like a world elsewhere or something like a spiritual world which is beyond our understanding according to them. So what is a dialectics? Dialectics mainly, it means a discourse of oppositions. It is a discourse of opposition. Basically, all these ancient philosophers have propounded this idea of dialectics. Dialectics, as it means, simply it is a kind of a discourse between two or more people holding different points of view, and they will discuss about the subject and they wish to establish the truth through all those recent methods of argumentation. So dialectics somewhat resembles a debate. All those ancient concept of dialectics, it actually resembled a debate, but dialectics actually explored all those subjective elements like emotional appeal, and there is nothing like a didactic element in it. Didacticism is actually a conversation in which one person tries to teach the other. Here, dialectics is actually a discourse of oppositions, discourse of oppositions in ideas and forms. That is dialectics. As I said earlier, Hegel talked about Hegel talked about dialectical idealism, and he brings about three developmental stages in dialectics. It is he develops a threefold structure for dialectics, and one is thesis, thesis in which there is, he says that thesis is something which gives rise to a kind of reaction. And then there is an antithesis, antithesis in which contradicts or negates this thesis, that is antithesis. And then lastly, there is this tension between the two, thesis and antithesis, which is resolved by means of synthesis. So in more simplistic terms, you can say that it is something like problem, reaction and solution. And there are three laws of dialectics mentioned by Hegel. That is also important. Three laws given by Engels. That is law of interpenetration of forces, unity and contradiction of opposites, you can say. And then there is a law of negation, and law of the transformation of quantity to quality. So this law of unity and conflict of opposites, contradiction of opposites, is the core of dialectics. This law actually reveals that there are internal sides, there are tendencies and forces of an object or phenomena which are mutually exclusive, but at the same time they presuppose each other. There is something like an inseparable interconnection of these opposite tendencies or contradictions, which is responsible for the unity of opposites. So this contradictoriness of objects, phenomena, is of a universal nature. We can understand that there is no object or phenomenon in the world which could not be divided into opposites. So these opposites coexist, and one is inconceivable without another. However, these opposites cannot exist peacefully in one object. They are contradictory, mutually exclusive, but later it causes a struggle between them. There is something like struggle between old and new, which certainly comes into conflict. And here he tries to say that the point is everything has a self-contradictory nature. The presence of opposites containing within itself its own opposite, and all these systems will generate its own contradictory forces within itself. So that is law of interpenetration of forces, or law of unity and contradiction of opposites. And then you have the law of negation of the negation. As you know, this term negation was introduced in philosophy by Hegel, but as I said earlier, with an idealist meaning. Marx criticized Hegel and gave a materialistic interpretation of negation. Marx tried to show that negation is an integral part of development of reality itself. And according to this law, all these opposing forces within a system overturns it to form a new system, which will again undergo overturning because of its contradictory forces within. For example, capitalism is the negation of feudal society, and socialism would be the negation of feudal society, and socialism would be the negation of capitalism. That is, it is negation of negation. So capitalism is the negation of feudal society, and Socialism is actually the negation of feudal society. So essentially, socialism is the negation of capitalism. So that is negation of negation. All these opposing forces within a system overturns to form a new system, which will again go through overturning because of its contradictory forces, and this process goes on continuously. The first, as I said earlier, the first element is negated by second, which in turn is negated to form a third form, and third one will have some of the features of the second, but on a higher level. That is the second law. And then you have this law of the transition of quantity into quality. As I said earlier, in nature, everything is in a state of continuous movement and change. And certain things are arising or coming into existence, whereas certain things are developing, certain things are decaying at the same moment. So, essentially, the nature, the world around us is in a state of continuous flux. So Marxism believed that this law of reality is actually the law of change. And according to this law, the process of change is not a simple or gradual change. It is a product of quantitative advances which result in some kind of abstract qualitative changes at a particular moment when mature conditions are present. So there are these incremental changes in the system which will accumulate, and it result in all those radical changes, and it completely changed the nature of the system forever. So he's basically talking about this moment of revolution. So these are the three laws of dialectics mentioned by Engels. And historical materialism approach used this dialectical materialism in understanding, as I said earlier, in understanding the society and economy and to interpret historical changes. They used this concept of base, that is mode of production, and superstructure to understand historical society. So next we'll learn about what is base and superstructure in Marxist theory. Base, it is actually the means and relations of production. Base or modes of production comprises two factors. One is means of production and relations of production. Means of production, it is the degree to which man or human beings control nature, technology of production, labor. It contains all those technologies used in a production. It contains all those machines, all those labor, all those technology used to for this production. And then you have relations of production. It is all those social relations you find among the people involved in this process of production, who uses this means of production. And these social relations are determined by the level and character of the development of productive forces. You have this employer-employee working conditions, the technical division of labor, and property relations, who owns what, which comes into relations of production. So here basically people enter into relations to produce the necessities and amenities of life. And it is this base which determines society's other relationships, which comprise superstructure. So superstructure includes culture, institutions, all those political power structures, all those roles, rituals, and state. And the basic nature of superstructure is that it tries to reinforce or legitimize the base. Its main work is to legitimize or reinforce the base. But you should understand that relation of these two parts between base and superstructure is not strictly unidirectional. Marx and Engels have actually warned against something like an economic determinism, as a superstructure can also affect the base. It is something like a two-way process, base determining superstructure and superstructure reinforcing the base. However, the influence of the base is predominant. So this is what you see in as a reaction between base and superstructure. As I said earlier, base contains relations of production and means of production. So means of production are all those things you need to produce. As I said earlier, it contains machines, factories, land, raw materials, and as you know, all these things, all these means are owned by bourgeoisie. And relations of production, it is the relationship which exists among the people who are part of this production. Here you have bourgeoisie exploiting the proletariat. When you take feudal society, it is the relation of production. It is something like all those feudal lords exploiting villains, the working class there. And superstructure, as I said earlier, it contains education, family, mass media, religion, politics. So it has nothing to do with the production in society, but it is something which legitimates the base. So it is something like the base shapes the superstructure and superstructure legitimates the base. It is, as I said earlier, it is something like a two-way process. And based on the mode of production, Marx actually divided historical society into four forms. And first one, it is primitive communism. Here there is no classes, everything is communally owned. And then comes slave society, where you have masters and slaves. Feudal society, you have lords and villains or serfs. And capitalist society, you have bourgeoisie and proletariat. So all these, as you see in all these societies will have opposing classes, where one class opposes or exploits the another one, and a ruling class will be different in different stages. You have masters, lords, and bourgeoisie. And he talks about a socialist society. So the major aim of Marxism is to bring about a classless society based on this common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. So he brings about this idea of a future society, that is socialist society, which is basically classless society, which emerges after communist revolution. So here I stop. In the next sessions, we'll be talking about the other ideas related to Marxist theory, that is, they are class consciousness, alienation, commodity fetishism, and false consciousness. Thank you.